Listen first, react later. 12 Secrets of Stoicism for a calm mind and self-discipline. Most people think they lose peace because life is hard. That is not true. They lose peace because they react too fast to things that never deserved that much power over them. One careless comment ruins their mood. One cold look unsettles them. One delay steals their patience. One disagreement poisons the rest of their day. Then they call it stress, when in reality, it is exposure. Because the person who reacts too quickly is not living from inner authority. He is living from access. The world touches him, and his mind opens its gates without resistance. This is why so many people feel exhausted without understanding the real cause. They think the problem is the noise around them. Often the deeper problem is that they have never learned how to stop noise from becoming law inside them. They hear one sentence and already prepare their defense. They feel one slight discomfort and already build an interpretation. They do not pause long enough to see clearly. They do not listen long enough to understand what is actually there. They feel first, judge second, and regret later. That is how peace is lost, not in dramatic catastrophe, but in ordinary moments of undisciplined reaction. Stoicism offers a harder path and a freer one. It teaches that calm does not begin when the world becomes gentle. Calm begins when your mind stops kneeling before every impulse. The Stoics understood that the first reaction is often the least trustworthy one. It is usually the reaction of ego, fear, vanity, old pain, or wounded pride. It feels urgent, but urgency is not wisdom. It feels strong, but speed is not strength. Real strength begins when you create enough inner space for reason to enter before emotion is allowed to lead. Listen first, react later. That sounds simple until life tests you, until someone disrespects you, until someone misunderstands you, until pressure enters the room, until your pride is touched and your mouth begins to form words your better self has not approved. In those moments, you discover whether your mind belongs to you or to whatever happens to provoke it. That is the real test, not whether you can look calm, whether you can remain governed. In this video, you are not going to hear shallow advice about staying positive or pretending nothing affects you. You are going to hear something more severe and more useful. You are going to learn how listening becomes power, how the pause restores command, how silence reveals people, how emotional speed makes you easy to control, how speech exposes disorder, how measured response protects dignity, and how, little by little, a person stops being ruled by every disturbance and begins living from inner authority. Because the truth is brutal. Most people do not suffer only because life is difficult. They suffer because they keep giving immediate access to things that should have been made to wait. They call that honesty. They call it passion. They call it authenticity. The Stoic calls it slavery. And once you see that clearly, your whole relationship with conflict, emotion, and self-discipline begins to change. Your fastest reaction is often your weakest one. Remember that. Because the moment you stop giving every disturbance instant power over your mind, you begin recovering the one thing most people lose without even noticing: command over yourself. Most people think reacting fast proves confidence. In reality, it often proves dependence. A quick answer can look powerful on the surface, but underneath it may reveal something smaller. It may reveal a mind that cannot bear uncertainty. A mind that feels the need to defend itself before the full truth has even entered the room. A mind that mistakes movement for control. This is why so many people damage relationships, weaken their image, and lose their peace in moments they later wish they could relive. They were not acting from clarity, they were acting from emotional velocity. The Stoics knew that speed has a strange ability to disguise weakness as strength. A person speaks sharply and calls it courage. He reacts immediately and calls it self-respect. He interrupts, defends, corrects, and escalates, then convinces himself he was being strong because he was being forceful. But force is not the same as mastery. A mind that must react at once is a mind that has not learned to hold its own center. It is being dragged by the first impulse that arrives. Think about how often people react not to what happened, but to what they instantly decided it meant. A face changes and they assume rejection. A short reply arrives and they assume disrespect. A disagreement appears and they assume attack. Their reaction is fast because their insecurity is fast. Their pride is fast. Their fear is fast. But fast does not mean accurate. And the cost of that inaccuracy can be enormous. One sentence spoken too early can damage years of trust. One message sent in heat can leave a memory that does not fade. One impulsive answer can expose dependence where dignity should have remained intact. Epictetus understood this with ruthless clarity. He taught that what disturbs us is not events themselves, but our judgments about them. That idea is not soft, it is severe. It means the first blow to your peace often does not come from the world. It comes from the speed with which your mind turns impression into truth. It comes from how quickly you believe your first interpretation. It comes from how eagerly you let feeling become decision. And this is why listening matters so much. Listening slows the judgment. Listening interrupts the ego. Listening forces the mind to remain with reality longer than its impulses would prefer. Most people have never trained this. They hear one thing and their entire nervous system joins the conversation before reason does. Their peace is not anchored, it is exposed. That is why one comment can dominate the whole day. That is why a simple misunderstanding can create hours of internal noise. That is why criticism can feel like a wound instead of information. The person who lives this way is not free. He is available. Too available. Available to mood, to pressure, to offense, to appearances. Stoicism tries to end that vulnerability at the root. So this is the first secret. Speed is not strength. The mind that answers immediately is often the mind that has not yet learned how to stand still in the presence of discomfort. True strength is not found in the fastest reaction. It is found in the mind that can remain with the moment long enough to see more than its own first emotion. It is found in the person who does not treat every impulse as an order. It is found in the soul that has learned to say, "I feel this, but I will not kneel before it." That is the beginning of calm, not silence for its own sake, not suppression, not pretending you do not feel. Calm begins when you stop worshipping your first reaction as if it were wisdom. Because in many moments, your first reaction is not your guide. It is your test. Most people are not hearing reality. They are hearing reality through whatever inside them is most wounded. That is why so many conversations fail before they even begin. The other person speaks, but the words do not arrive cleanly. Pride intercepts them. Fear reshapes them. Old pain stains them. Insecurity adds meaning that was never there. Then the mind reacts, not to truth, but to a distorted version of truth that emotion has already rewritten. You are not hearing the words anymore. You are hearing them through your wound. This is one of the hardest lessons Stoicism teaches, because it refuses to flatter the intensity of your feelings. It does not assume that because you felt something strongly, you understood it correctly. In fact, it warns the opposite. Strong emotion is often the first sign that clarity is in danger. The mind in agitation exaggerates. It stretches offense. It invents hidden meanings. It turns ambiguity into accusation. It takes a simple comment and makes it personal. It takes silence and calls it rejection. It takes disagreement and hears disrespect. Most people never examine this. They obey it. They assume their first interpretation must be right because it arrived with force. But force and truth are not the same thing. A person gives them a short answer and they decide they are no longer valued. Someone forgets to reply and they decide they are being ignored. A serious expression appears on a face and they decide hostility is present. Then they react to these private stories as if they were facts. This is how unnecessary suffering multiplies. Not because reality was cruel, but because emotion contaminated reality before the mind had learned to receive it cleanly. Epictetus would ask a devastating question here. What actually happened? Not what you fear it means, not what your pride wants to defend, not what your insecurity added to it. What actually happened? That question is a form of freedom. It separates fact from projection. It slows the imagination before it turns uncertainty into pain. It restores discipline to perception, and perception is everything. Because when perception is distorted, even wise advice sounds offensive, even neutral moments feel threatening, and even ordinary life begins to resemble hostility. The calm mind is not merely a quiet mind, it is a clean mind. A mind that knows how to receive reality before rewriting it. A mind that does not automatically trust every impression just because it arrived first. A mind that understands that emotion is partial. It sees one fragment and pretends to see the whole. The Stoic does not grant it that authority. He places every impression on trial. He asks whether it is accurate, necessary, useful, or distorted. He learns to distrust intensity when intensity appears before understanding. This discipline changes everything. It changes how you hear criticism. It changes how you read people. It changes how you interpret silence, tension, conflict, disappointment, and uncertainty. It prevents you from suffering over motives that were never there, insults that were never intended, and judgments that existed only inside your own fear. It does not make you naive, it makes you exact. So this is the second secret. Emotion often distorts what you hear before you even know it is happening. The undisciplined mind receives life through its wounds. The disciplined mind learns to receive life through examination. And once you understand that, you stop asking only what was said. You begin asking what inside you rushed to translate it. Silence is one of the most misunderstood forms of power. Most people think silence is emptiness, hesitation, or passivity. They think strength must show itself through speed, certainty, and immediate expression. But Stoicism teaches something far more dangerous. Silence is not empty. Silence is information. It is where people reveal what emotion would have hidden from you if you had reacted too soon. Most people expose themselves if you let them continue. That is why the impatient mind loses so much. It hears one offensive phrase and interrupts. It feels one slight pressure and rushes to defend itself. It cannot tolerate the discomfort of waiting, so it fills the silence with its own agitation. And because of that, it misses the deeper truth of the moment. It misses the insecurity behind the arrogance. It misses the contradiction inside the speech. It misses the vanity, the jealousy, the confusion, the fear. The other person was revealing everything, but reaction got in the way of observation. The Stoic understands that people often tell you far more than they intended to tell you, especially when they are not interrupted by your emotion. A manipulator reveals himself over time. A liar reveals himself over time. A bitter person reveals himself over time. A weak mind reveals itself over time. But only to the one who can remain still long enough to see the pattern unfold. This is why silence is not simply restraint. It is diagnosis. It lets character emerge without interference. And the truth is, many people depend on your speed because your speed protects them. The moment you react, the focus moves away from them and onto your reaction. Their motive becomes hidden again. Their instability becomes less visible. Their contradiction escapes examination. But when you stay composed, When you let the silence remain, when you refuse to rush into defense, something changes. The other person has to continue standing next to his own words, and often that is where the truth begins to show. There is another side to this, one even more important. Silence does not only reveal the other person, it reveals you. The urge to interrupt, explain, retaliate, or prove something exposes the exact place where your ego still panics. It shows you where pride still wants immediate relief. It shows you how badly you still need to be seen correctly in every moment. That is why silence can feel so uncomfortable. It makes both people visible. The other person reveals his condition, and you discover yours. Marcus Aurelius understood that other people act according to the condition of their own minds. If they are confused, they will speak from confusion. If they are vain, they will speak from vanity. If they are bitter, they will speak from bitterness. Your mistake is not hearing them. Your mistake is entering their condition too quickly. You do not need to become chaotic, because chaos is speaking to you. You can remain outside the storm long enough to study it. That is not weakness, that is command. So this is the third secret. Silence is not a void, it is a window. It reveals what speech is trying to hide. It exposes the hidden architecture beneath words. The person who cannot remain silent long enough will spend life reacting to surfaces. The person who can remain still long enough begins to perceive depth, and depth changes everything. There is a moment in every difficult situation that determines almost everything, and most people never notice it. It is the small space between what happens and what they do next. A message arrives, a criticism lands, a plan fails, a tone changes, an insult appears. And in that instant, the mind wants to run toward reaction as if speed were survival. But that small interval is where peace is either preserved or surrendered. The pause is where your mind remembers it does not belong to the first impulse. Most people live as if whatever touches them first has already earned authority. Something pleasant happens and they rise. Something offensive happens and they fall. Something uncertain happens and anxiety takes command. Their center keeps being relocated by circumstance. This is why they are exhausted. Their inner life has no firm governor. It is constantly being moved by events that have not yet been examined. The pause interrupts that slavery. It says, "This happened, but it has not yet become me." Epictetus would insist that between impression and judgment, there must be discipline. Without that discipline, every impression becomes an order. Anger says strike back. Fear says withdraw. Pride says defend yourself now. Vanity says prove your worth. Hurt says make them feel it. And the undisciplined person obeys whichever voice shouts first. The Stoic does something else. He hears the voice and refuses immediate loyalty. He creates enough stillness for reason to arrive before reaction becomes action. That pause may only last a few seconds, but those seconds can save years of regret. Think of the message you almost sent, the argument you almost escalated, the sentence you almost released just to satisfy the violence of a passing emotion. Many people look back on their worst moments and realize the true tragedy was not what happened to them. It was how quickly they surrendered their inner command. One unnecessary response can create consequences far larger than the event that triggered it. Seneca knew that agitation narrows vision. In anger, the mind sees only the offense. In fear, it sees only the threat. In wounded pride, it sees only the need to restore image. But once you pause, the field begins to widen. You notice context. You notice your own fatigue. You notice the difference between what is real and what your ego is adding. You notice that not every tension deserves escalation. You notice that silence may be stronger than argument. That widening is where command returns. The pause is not passivity. It is recovery of the throne. It is the mind refusing to be overthrown by its own first movement. It is the body and soul declining to kneel before urgency, and that is why it feels so powerful when practiced honestly. Every time you pause instead of collapsing into reaction, you prove to yourself that your mind is still yours. That proof builds trust within. It teaches the soul that strength is not measured by how quickly it can move, but by whether it can remain governed while emotion is demanding motion. So this is the fourth secret. The pause restores inner command. It gives clarity time to enter. It prevents impulse from becoming law. It keeps the event outside from instantly becoming disorder inside. And once that pause becomes part of your character, your whole presence begins to change. You become harder to rush, harder to bait, and much harder to break. One of the greatest reasons people lose peace is not because life is full of difficult things. It is because they treat every difficult thing as if it deserves access to the center of their mind. Every criticism, every rude tone, every small delay, every careless opinion, every misunderstanding, every slight inconvenience. Their peace becomes crowded with things that were never worthy of entering it. Then they wonder why calm feels impossible. Every reaction is a purchase. Most people are spending their peace on things that were never worth the price. This is where Stoicism becomes severe in the best possible way. It forces you to admit that not everything reaching you deserves your emotion. Not every insult deserves your anger. Not every misunderstanding deserves your explanation. Not every provocation deserves your attention. Not every invitation deserves acceptance. Most people still live as if the world can throw anything at them and they are somehow obligated to respond internally. That habit does not come from wisdom. It comes from undisciplined importance. The ego feels touched, so the whole mind declares an emergency. But emotion is costly. Every time you react, you spend something: time, energy, clarity, dignity, focus, presence. And the person who spends these things too cheaply eventually feels empty without understanding why. A careless remark from a small mind steals his whole morning. A social slight follows him into the night. A stranger's tone remains alive in his body long after the encounter has ended. He's tired because he keeps emotionally financing things that never deserved investment. Marcus Aurelius knew that the mind must remain selective if it is to remain free. Whatever you nourish grows inside you. Feed resentment and resentment expands. Feed insult and insult takes root. Feed petty conflict and petty conflict becomes the atmosphere of the soul. But starve these things and they weaken. This is why the Stoic learns to recognize provocation as an invitation rather than a command. Anger is invited. Wounded pride is invited. Despair is invited. The question is whether you accept. An invitation is not an order. It can be declined. That distinction changes a life. The average person feels the invitation and enters the room immediately. The Stoic stands at the doorway and asks whether the room is worth entering at all. That simple delay saves immense energy, because many people are not destroyed by one great tragedy. They are worn down by hundreds of accepted invitations that should have been refused. There is maturity in realizing that hearing something does not obligate you to carry it. You can hear criticism without letting it colonize your identity. You can witness bitterness without making bitterness your burden. You can see pettiness without kneeling to it. This is not numbness, it is filtration. And filtration is essential for any disciplined mind. Without it, the world pours directly into the soul in whatever form it chooses. So this is the fifth secret. Not every invitation deserves your emotion. Calm does not come from controlling the world. It comes from refusing to emotionally sponsor every disturbance the world produces. Once you understand that, peace becomes less mysterious. You stop asking why everything affects you so much, and you start asking why you have been giving everything permission to matter. Words are never the whole message. Most people react to sentences while remaining blind to the force that produced them. They hear what was said, but they do not hear why it was said, when it was said, or what need is moving beneath it. That is why they are constantly confused by people. They judge speech at the surface and miss the motive underneath. Some people speak to clarify, others speak to control. If you cannot hear the difference, you will suffer more than necessary. This is one of the hidden powers of Stoic listening. It does not stop at words. It asks what energy is hiding inside them. Is this person speaking from fear, vanity, envy, insecurity, pain, confusion, or a sincere desire for truth? The words alone may not tell you. Tone, timing, insistence, contradiction, and emotional atmosphere often reveal much more. A sharp sentence may come from frustration rather than malice. Praise may come from strategy rather than admiration. Concern may be disguised control. Criticism may be disguised envy. The average person never studies this carefully enough. He hears a sharp tone and becomes defensive. He hears a flattering tone and becomes trusting. He hears certainty and assumes honesty. He hears apology and assumes sincerity. In each case, he is responding to appearances rather than deeper structure. That is why he is easy to confuse. He is listening only at the level where words are loudest, not where intentions are truest. Seneca understood that human beings are often least honest when they sound most certain. Certainty can be compensation. Loudness can be camouflage. Moral language can hide disorder. Indignation can be wounded pride wearing noble clothes. The Stoic does not become cynical when learning this. He becomes perceptive. Cynicism assumes the worst. Perception simply looks more carefully. When you start hearing motive, social life changes. You begin noticing when criticism carries unusual pleasure. You notice when someone keeps returning to a point not because it matters, but because they need to dominate the rhythm of the interaction. You notice when praise feels like bait. You notice when disapproval arrives precisely where it can create insecurity. You notice who is trying to understand and who is trying to transfer unrest into you. That awareness protects peace because it keeps you from giving the wrong response to the wrong kind of energy. There is also discipline required here. To hear motive, you must resist your need to react immediately. You must tolerate ambiguity long enough for the pattern to show itself. You must silence the inner voice that keeps saying, answer now, defend now, explain now. That takes humility. It takes the willingness to admit that your first emotion may not yet understand the moment. But once you learn this, you become harder to fool and harder to provoke. So this is the sixth secret. Hear motive, not just words. Words are the surface. Motive is the engine. The person who only hears language will remain vulnerable to confusion. The person who hears intention begins to move through life with a calmer intelligence, one that does not panic at sharp speech and does not surrender to polished speech. That person stops reacting to every phrase and starts seeing the soul behind it. Many people do not lose respect because they were wrong. They lose respect because they answered beneath their own dignity. That is what most people fail to understand about self-control. Dignity is not a fixed possession. It is something that must be preserved in motion. It is revealed precisely when life pressures you to step below your own standard. Dignity is not what you claim to have. It is what remains when emotion is denied the right to lead. A single undisciplined reaction can make a strong person look small. A desperate explanation can make a dignified person appear uncertain. An emotional outburst can give away years of carefully built self-command. The tragedy is not merely that someone else behaved badly. It is that you allowed his disorder to lower the quality of your own response. That is how dignity gets spent, not by major betrayals of principle, but by small collapses under pressure. Most people feel challenged and immediately think they must prove strength through volume, speed, or emotional force. But those things often reveal the opposite. They reveal a person who could not bear being misunderstood for another few seconds. A person who could not tolerate the tension of not correcting the image immediately. A person whose ego demanded relief before character had time to speak. The Stoic sees the trap. He understands that not every misunderstanding must be corrected instantly, and not every accusation deserves a full emotional defense. Cato's greatness did not come only from what he believed. It came from what he refused to become under pressure. That is the deeper lesson. Dignity is continuity. It is the ability to remain yourself while others invite you to step below yourself. When another person becomes theatrical, can you remain measured? When another person becomes reckless, can you remain governed? When pride demands instant answer, can you wait long enough for reason to approve the response? That is dignity in practice. And there is another reason this matters. Dignity is not just how others see you, it is how you remain able to see yourself afterward. Many people leave conversations regretting not the truth they spoke, but the condition from which they spoke it. They know they were dragged. They know they became smaller. They know they answered from hurt, not from principle. That memory stays with them because the soul recognizes when it has acted beneath its own standard. Delayed response protects dignity because it gives your higher mind time to return before your lower mind spends your character on something cheap. It asks whether the answer forming inside you is worthy of you, whether it is yours or whether it is being forced out by pride, humiliation, anger, or fear. That question alone can save a person from enormous regret. So this is the seventh secret. Reacting late protects dignity. It preserves the quality of your response from the violence of your first impulse. It keeps you from being reduced by the very thing you are trying to resist. And once you understand that, you stop measuring strength by who reacted harder. You start measuring it by who remained most governed. Many people appear powerful only because they know how to exploit speed. They rely on urgency because urgency weakens judgment. They rely on pressure because pressure narrows vision. They rely on emotional acceleration because a rushed mind is easier to direct. This is why so much manipulation depends on one thing above all else: your hurry. Manipulators do not need your agreement. They only need your speed. They want immediate guilt, immediate fear, immediate defense, immediate apology, immediate emotional participation. They do not want you calm. They do not want you examining the full shape of what is happening. They want your nervous system involved before your judgment is awake. Because once you are emotionally captured, you become easier to steer. You feel active, but you are being guided. You feel expressive, but you are being read. You feel strong, but you are moving exactly where pressure wanted you to move. This happens in ways both obvious and subtle. Some people provoke directly with accusation, interruption, insult, or sarcasm. Others use disappointment, silence, false urgency, moral superiority, or carefully timed withdrawal. The method changes, but the aim is similar. They want access to your unstable parts before clarity arrives. They want the version of you that reacts from panic, pride, vanity, or fear. That version is easier to control than the calm one. A rushed mind agrees to things it would reject in peace. It apologizes for things that are not its burden. It explains because it fears being misread. It attacks because it fears being diminished. It says yes because it fears tension. In every case, emotional capture has replaced centered judgment. And emotional capture is the mechanism many manipulative people depend on. They do not need to overpower your logic. They only need to interrupt your pace. Epictetus would remind you that no one can truly govern your inner life unless you cooperate by surrendering your judgment. That cooperation often happens very quickly, A tone unsettles you, a sentence stings you, a facial expression activates your insecurity. Suddenly you are defending, proving, over-explaining, escalating. You think you are protecting yourself. In reality, you may be serving someone else's strategy through the predictability of your own impulse. The antidote is calm, not as mood, but as defense. Calm protects sequence. Calm keeps you from moving when the other person wants movement more than truth. Calm lets you ask the decisive questions. Why must this be answered right now? Why does this feel designed to create emotional motion? Why is the atmosphere itself doing so much work? Those questions restore distance, and distance weakens control. There is enormous freedom in refusing to move just because someone is pushing. You do not have to answer on their schedule. You do not have to adopt their volume. You do not have to carry the urgency they are trying to place into your hands. Once you slow the exchange, their method becomes easier to see. Once you remain composed, their leverage begins to collapse. So this is the eighth secret. Manipulators need your hurry because hurry weakens your judgment and hands them access to the unstable parts of you. The moment you stop reacting on demand, much of their power disappears, and the moment you see that clearly, you stop confusing pressure with truth. Many people are not tired because life is too heavy. They are tired because their mind argues with everything. It argues with delays, traffic, inconvenience, criticism, misunderstanding, uncertainty, rejection, and the simple fact that reality does not always obey preference. Even when nothing is being said aloud, a draining conversation is still taking place within them. Why did this happen? Why are people like this? Why is this so unfair? Why can nothing go the way I want? And because this internal argument never ends, peace never has room to settle. The event happens once, the mind relives it 100 times. This is one of the most underestimated forms of suffering. The problem enters reality for a few minutes, then the mind keeps it alive for hours. A rude comment is spoken, and long after the room is quiet, the inner courtroom remains open. A disappointment arrives, and the person does not merely feel it. He rehearses it. He fights it. He protests its existence again and again. This is how exhaustion deepens, not simply through pain, but through resistance repeated until it becomes identity. Marcus Aurelius knew that much suffering comes not from events, but from the mind's refusal to let events be what they are before deciding what to do about them. That refusal is expensive. A delay happens, and anger is added. A mistake happens, and internal theater is added. A difficult personality appears, and an entire philosophy of resentment is added. Life presents one thing. The mind adds 10 more. Then it wonders why it feels so heavy. Epictetus would force a cleaner question. What is fact and what is my protest against fact? A delay is fact. Fury at the delay is an addition. A harsh word is fact. The internal replay, the imagined counter-arguments, the mental revenge, these are additions. A bad outcome is fact. The endless demand that it should not have happened long after it already has is an addition. Stoicism does not eliminate pain, but it refuses to glorify unnecessary additions. Most people have never learned this distinction, so they live in constant internal opposition. They call it awareness. Often it is attachment to control. The mind cannot accept that life includes friction, so it keeps arguing with every rough edge as if protest could smooth reality into obedience. But reality does not answer protest. It only receives response. The Stoic therefore becomes selective. He does not mentally wrestle every disturbance into the ground. He observes what is here, accepts that it is here, and then decides what deserves action and what deserves release. This discipline is not passivity. It is conservation of power. A person who argues internally with everything becomes emotionally expensive to himself. Everything costs him too much. A delay costs him calm. A mistake costs him the afternoon. An inconvenient personality costs him his balance. The Stoic pays differently. He still notices. He still acts when necessary. But he refuses to grant every irritation a permanent room in thought. So this is the ninth secret. The mind becomes calmer when it stops arguing with everything. Not because life becomes softer, but because the soul stops wasting energy on useless resistance. It learns that not every inconvenience deserves outrage, not every disappointment deserves rehearsal, and not every disturbance deserves a second life inside the mind. Before a person loses control of life, he usually loses control of speech. That is one of the clearest signs of inner disorder. Most people imagine self-discipline as something dramatic, visible in routines, sacrifice, achievement, or public strength. But long before disorder shows itself in the outer structure of life, it usually appears in the mouth. In the sentence that could not be restrained, in the explanation that was too eager, in the reaction that escaped before reflection, in the sarcasm, the complaint, the overpromise, the defensive reply, the unnecessary confession. The mouth is often the first place where inner instability becomes public. This is why the Stoics took speech so seriously. Words do not merely express the soul. They often expose its level of command. A person who cannot restrain speech usually cannot restrain thought for very long. A person who says whatever rises in the moment may call himself honest, but often what he is displaying is not honesty. It is undisciplined transparency. And undisciplined transparency is expensive. It weakens dignity. It damages trust. It exposes insecurity. It turns passing emotion into lasting consequence. Anger wants speech. Pride wants speech. Fear wants speech. Vanity wants speech. Hurt wants speech. In every case, the mind says this must be said now. But urgency is often lying. Many things feel necessary in the heat of emotion and become deeply regrettable in the light of reason. This is why self-discipline begins in the mouth. Because the mouth is where inner storms first try to become reality. Think about how often people damage their position by talking too much. They explain themselves beyond necessity and expose uncertainty. They argue past the point of usefulness and expose dependence on being right. They complain repeatedly and train their own soul in resentment. They disclose private struggles to the wrong people and later wonder why those vulnerabilities were mishandled. In each case, the problem is not speech itself. The problem is speech released from compulsion rather than choice. Seneca knew that a careless sentence can undo months of trust. A proud answer can turn minor tension into major fracture. A moment of verbal indulgence can create a memory that follows a person long after the original emotion has vanished. This is why restraint in speech is not silence for its own sake. It is protection of the future from the instability of the present. It is the refusal to let a temporary feeling write a permanent outcome. There is freedom in learning that not every thought deserves publication. Not every feeling deserves a voice. Not every reaction deserves sound. Once you understand that, speech becomes a deliberate act instead of a reflex. You stop admiring raw expression as strength. You start recognizing measured expression as mastery. You begin to feel the difference between being possessed by your mouth and actually possessing it. So this is the 10th secret. Self-discipline begins in the mouth because speech is where private disorder first tries to become public reality. The undisciplined tongue reveals a mind too eager to discharge what should first be examined. The disciplined tongue shows a mind that has learned the difference between what is felt and what is worthy of being said. Most people are still impressed by intensity. They think the strongest response is the loudest one, the sharpest one, the one that leaves no doubt that emotion has fully entered the room. But Stoicism sees something deeper. Intensity may be impressive for a moment. Proportion is powerful for a lifetime. A measured response does not mean a weak response. It means force has not been allowed to outrun wisdom. It means the person has not sacrificed proportion to satisfy the violence of a passing feeling. This is where many people fail. They think if they feel something strongly, they must express it strongly or risk appearing small. But that is often the trap. The louder the response, the more likely it is compensating for instability underneath. Seneca understood that anger impersonates strength. It makes the mind feel larger, clearer, more justified than it truly is. The same is true of humiliation, panic, and wounded pride. Each one insists that more force is more truth. But that is rarely so. A small offense gets a massive answer. A misunderstanding is treated like betrayal. A temporary slight becomes a permanent fracture. The person feels strong in the moment, but what remains afterward is not authority. It is consequence. Measured response is an art. It is the art of giving reality only the amount of force reality deserves and no more. It is the refusal to let emotion inflate the scale of the moment. It asks not what your wound wants to say, but what truth requires. Very often, those are not the same thing. Epictetus would remind you that events do not command your manner of response. They only create the occasion for your character to become visible. That is why measured response is one of the clearest signs of self-mastery. It shows that the person is no longer answering merely from stimulus. He is answering from principle. He is not asking what will satisfy the hurt part of me right now. He is asking what preserves clarity, dignity, and effectiveness. Marcus Aurelius returned constantly to the need to keep the ruling faculty upright. That is the essence of measured strength. It does not refuse firmness. It refuses contamination. It does not avoid action. It avoids excess. It does not fear difficult truth. It simply refuses to let truth be carried by the trembling hands of ego. When a person learns this, even his silence begins to carry weight, because people sense that his speech, when it comes, will not be wasteful. And there is another beauty in measured response. It is harder to regret. The person who speaks with proportion rarely leaves the moment feeling that he betrayed himself. He may still have drawn boundaries. He may still have corrected, refused, confronted, or walked away. But he did so without becoming excessive. He did not let the ugliness of the moment rewrite the quality of his own presence. So this is the 11th secret. The strongest response is often the most measured one. Real strength is not the power to release emotion at full force. It is the power to hold force in proportion to wisdom. Once you understand that, conflict changes. You stop asking how to dominate the moment, and you start asking how to remain governed within it. There comes a point when calm is no longer just a technique and discipline is no longer just an effort. They begin to feel like identity, not because the world has become easier, not because people have become kinder, not because pressure has disappeared, but because something inside has stopped waiting for the outer world to grant permission for peace. That is the final transformation Stoicism points toward. Inner authority. When peace no longer waits for permission from the world, inner authority has begun. Most people live with borrowed authority. Their mood depends on treatment. Their confidence depends on praise. Their peace depends on agreement. Their stability depends on circumstances cooperating. One insult changes the day. One rejection changes the self-image. One disappointment changes the whole atmosphere of the mind. That is what happens when the ruling center of life has been placed outside. The world becomes the master key to the soul. And because the world is unstable, the soul becomes unstable with it. Stoicism offers something rarer. It teaches that the governing principle of your life must be brought back inside, not into self-absorption, but into self-rule. Marcus Aurelius knew that no title, no admiration, no social power could replace inward command. A person may command others and still be a servant to insult. He may appear confident and still be shaken by smaller minds. That is not authority. That is dependency wearing noble clothes. Listening first is therefore much more than a communication skill. It is a form of self-government. The moment you stop reacting immediately, you create a space in which your deeper mind can take its rightful seat. You stop acting like a citizen of every emotional disturbance and begin acting like the guardian of your own inner order. That shift may be invisible to others at first, but it changes everything. You stop depending on outer conditions to stabilize your inner state. You begin building a mind that remains itself even when conditions are not favorable. Epictetus, who knew what it meant to live without outward control, understood perhaps more deeply than anyone that real freedom is inward. The person who examines impressions, filters provocation, guards speech and responds with proportion is not merely calm, he is self-ruled. He is no longer available for possession by every mood entering the room. He is no longer easy to drive through guilt, urgency, panic, vanity, or pressure. He has become selective with his inner allegiance. He gives it to reason, not to noise. There is something unmistakable about a person who reaches this point. He does not need to win every conversation because his worth is not on trial in every exchange. He does not need to answer every misunderstanding because his identity is not built from other people's temporary conclusions. He does not need to perform calm because calm has become structural. His speech carries less waste, his silence carries less fear, his actions carry more precision. People feel this, even if they cannot name it. They sense that his center is no longer easily accessible to disturbance. So this is the 12th secret. Listening first creates inner authority because it trains the mind to return to its rightful ruler before action is taken. It teaches the soul that not every impulse deserves obedience, not every pressure deserves compliance, and not every external movement deserves internal surrender. Over time, this becomes more than a method. It becomes posture, it becomes character, it becomes freedom. The world will remain loud, people will remain careless, pressure will remain real. There will still be disrespect, misunderstanding, delay, conflict, disappointment, and all the ordinary forms of friction that test the hidden structure of a human being. Stoicism never promised to remove those things. It promised something harder and far more valuable. It promised that you do not have to abandon yourself when those things arrive. That is the final lesson. Peace does not belong to the person who is never tested. It belongs to the person who no longer abandons himself when the test begins. Everything we have explored points toward this. Speed is not strength. Emotion distorts what it hears. Silence reveals. The pause restores command. Not every invitation deserves emotion. Motive matters more than surface. Dignity is preserved by delay. Manipulation depends on hurry. The mind exhausts itself by arguing with everything. Speech exposes disorder. Measured response carries more power than intensity. Inner authority begins when peace stops waiting for permission from the world. None of these are isolated insights. Together they form a way of being. Most people still live as if the outer world has automatic access to the inner throne. A look can move them, a comment can wound them, a delay can poison them, a disagreement can consume them. Their peace is fragile because it is negotiated with circumstance. Stoicism calls for something stronger. It asks you to build a self whose first loyalty is not to impulse, not to pride, not to fear, not to appearance, but to reasoned character. That is what makes calm durable. That is what makes discipline more than performance. So the next time life presses against you, remember this. You do not need to answer every moment at the speed it demands. You do not need to let your first feeling become your final decision. You do not need to give every disturbance the right to enter and rule. Pause, listen, let the surface settle. Let motive reveal itself. Let reason return to its seat before your mouth becomes the servant of a passing storm. Because the person who listens first and reacts later becomes difficult to manipulate, difficult to provoke, difficult to confuse, difficult to reduce. Not because he feels nothing, but because he has stopped giving everything immediate power over him. He has become heavier in the best sense, harder to move without reason, harder to deceive through emotion, harder to shake through noise. In a world that rewards speed, outrage, and constant exposure, that kind of inner weight is rare. It is almost revolutionary. So do not leave this with the shallow desire to look calm. Leave with something more serious. Decide that before reaction, there will be examination. Before judgment, there will be listening. Before speech, there will be proportion. Decide that your mind will no longer be rented by every passing disturbance. Decide that your peace will no longer be given away so cheaply. The world will remain loud. People will remain careless. Pressure will remain real. But now you know this. You do not have to become smaller just because the moment is trying to shrink you. You do not have to become chaotic because chaos is speaking to you. You do not have to become hurried because urgency has entered the room. You can remain yours. Listen first. React later. Let truth arrive before emotion decides. Let your silence become intelligent. Let your speech become chosen. Let your mind remain your own. Because once that discipline takes root, peace no longer feels like luck. It becomes structure. And structure is what remains when life begins to test you for real. If this message spoke to you, subscribe to the channel and stay close to this path of self-mastery, discipline, and inner strength. In the comments, write this sentence as a commitment to yourself. I choose the pause.